Hello students, I hope you are all fine and in good health. In this audio presentation, I will be discussing the broad questions from the chapter The Address. So dear students, let's start. Now before I proceed to the broad question part, let us read something about the author. And as you all know, the name of the author is Marga Minko. Now Marga Minko was a Dutch journalist and writer, and in the early part of the Second World War, Marga Minko lived in Amsterdam, that is Holland. Almost everything Marga Minko had written was to a greater or lesser degree marked by her experiences as a Jew in the Netherlands during the German occupation, that is from 1940 to 1945. So more or less her novels and her short stories are related to her experiences that she had endured during the Second World War, the brutalities, the torture, the violence that she had seen during the Second World War, and mostly her novels are more or less related to those experiences only. She was the youngest child in an Orthodox Jewish family. She was the only member of her family to survive the Second World War. This is something very important for us to know, that she was the only one in her family who had survived the Second World War. Even if you see this particular story, The Address, you will find that the author, the narrator, was the only one in her family who had survived the war. The rest of the other people in her family, they all died, including her mother. So to a great extent, as I already had told to you all, dear students, that this particular chapter and this, or rather to say this particular story written by Marga Minko, it is a bit semi-autobiographical also, because some of the instances in this story had a lot of similarity with Marga Minko's own life. Now, let me continue. Her novels consist of short sentences. They are frequent flashbacks, which always keeps the readers in suspense. There are a lot of flashbacks, and in this story also we find a lot of flashbacks. And another speciality that can be noticed in her novels and short stories, that she used to write in short sentences. She used to use a lot of short sentences, and obviously frequent flashbacks can be seen, and which always keeps the readers in suspense. Now that was about the author Marga Minko. Now let us come to the first question. See, it is written, why did the narrator, Mrs. S.'s daughter, especially make a trip to 46 Marconi Street? Did she achieve her purpose? That was the question is, what was her real intention? What was her real intention of visiting 46 Marconi Street, the place where Mrs. Doling used to live? What was her main purpose? The narrator, Mrs. S.'s daughter, especially made a trip to 46 Marconi Street to get back her mother's priceless belongings, which Mrs. Doling had taken from her mother with the understanding that she would return them after the war. But dear students, by this time you all know about it. It was a fake assurance. It was not a real promise. It was a fake promise, or a fake assurance given by Mrs. Doling to the narrator's mother. And the narrator's mother, Mrs. S., her full name has not been mentioned. She was very innocent, gullible by nature, and can be easily deceived by others. So dear students, let me continue. She did not achieve her purpose as she could not get them back. The narrator met with an extremely cold and unfriendly atmosphere at 46 Marconi Street, because Mrs. Doling behaved in a very rude manner and pretended not to recognize the narrator. pretended that she haven't seen the narrator. And her behavior towards the narrator was cold, rude and indifferent. Remember these three things, dear students, that the behavior of Mrs. Doling towards the narrator was rude, cold and indifferent. Mrs. Doling did not like that she had come back for them. Now the important thing was that Mrs. Doling was never happy. Rather, she was very upset and she was very anxious and she was irritated also by looking at the narrator, because she thought that no one would survive from the narrator's family, because despite being rich, the narrator's family was a Jewish family. But the narrator was the only one who survived the war, as we can see in this particular chapter, as we can read in this particular chapter. That evokes the autobiographical element also, because as I told you that Marga Minko, she was also the only one who had survived the war from her family. Here also a similar instance can be seen in the life of the main protagonist, of the main narrator. She was the only one who survived the war, and she lost not only her mother but also their house because of the atrocities, violence and brutalities of the Second World War. Now, dear students, let me move on. Mrs. Doling did not like that she had come back for them. She refused to recognize her first. She did not allow the narrator to enter their house. Then she pretended to be busy and closed the door on her face. Now, pretend means to act falsely. She pretended to be busy and closed the door on the face of the narrator, to make the narrator realize that she was not interested to have a talk with her. So, dear students, now I am moving on to the next question, that is question number 2. See, it is written, how did Mrs. Doling receive Mrs. S.'s daughter when she came back after several years? How do you explain her behavior? Now, whether she was received cordially or whether she was never allowed inside the house, in order to know that, we have to read this answer. So, dear students, let's continue. Mrs. Doling was extremely cold, unfriendly, indifferent to the narrator. Mrs. S.'s daughter, when she came back after several years, she understood she had come to claim the beautiful possessions like antiques and silver cutlery which had belonged to her family. Because Mrs. Doling, she was very shrewd, she was very clever, she realized the real intention of the narrator, that the narrator actually came to take the possessions of her mother's precious belongings. So, but Mrs. Doling had no intention of returning those things back to her. Therefore, her behavior towards the narrator was cold and rude. She did not even let her in. She did not even allow her inside the house. She told her that she could not do anything for her. It was not convenient for her to meet the narrator and that she should come some other time. Even very politely, she decided not to meet with the narrator. She told the narrator on her face that this is not the right time, or this is not the convenient time for her to have a conversation with the narrator. And then she closed the door while the narrator was still on the doorstep. And finally, what she did, just like any other rude woman, she closed the door on the face of the narrator while the narrator was still standing near her doorstep. Now, that shows that she was reluctant to have a conversation with the narrator, and that actually exposes the true nature of Mrs. Doling. How far she was a good lady, there is a big question mark regarding that. Now, Dear students, I am moving on to the third question. As you all can see, it is written. Describe the second visit of Mrs. S.'s daughter to the house of Mrs. Doling. Why did she not wait to meet Mrs. Doling? Now, this is very important. Now, on her second visit, she was allowed inside the house by the 15-year-old daughter of Mrs. Doling. So, let me come to the answer part. Let me explain the answer part. When the narrator went the second time, because the first time it was a failure on her part, because she tried her best but she was never allowed inside the house by Mrs. Doling. So she tried one more time. The second time, the daughter of Mrs. Doling allowed the narrator inside the house. When the narrator went the second time to 46 Marconi Street, it was Mrs. Doling's daughter who opened the door and let the narrator come into the house. Immediately she recognized her mother's priceless possessions. She noticed the Hanukkah, that is the candle holder, which belonged to her family. The walls had the antiques, her familiar woolen tablecloth, everything she saw, and that brought in her mind the nostalgia, the nostalgic memories related to her mother. The walls had the antiques, her familiar woolen tablecloth was on the table, and she even recognized a painting also. Even that was also brought by Mrs. Doling from their house. The teapot, the silver cutlery of her family, everything she was able to recognize. Those things actually belonged to her mother. Seeing these things, however, they did not give her any pleasure. Why? Because the things were kept in a very haphazard manner. And not only that, poor maintenance. The things were not kept in a proper manner, in a very tasteless way. The things were kept and not handed properly. Rather, we can say the things were handed carelessly. Okay, the way the things were kept, it can be said that the things were handed very carelessly. She was filled with disgust and suddenly lost the desire to get those beautiful things back. She was very depressed by looking at her mother's belongings and decided to leave that place all at once. So she did not want to meet Mrs. Doling and left the house, deciding never to visit 46 Marconi Street again. And even she had made up her mind and decided never to visit this place once again. She wanted to start her life fresh once again. Now I am moving on to question number 4. Very important question this is, dear students. Question is, how did Mrs. Doling acquire the possessions of Mrs. S.'s belongings? What extraordinary circumstances made it possible? Do you justify Mrs. Doling's conduct? That means, do you justify the behavior of Mrs. Doling, whatever she did, whether it was right or wrong, you have to justify regarding that. Mrs. Doling was merely an acquaintance of Mrs. S. And remember, for the greed of possessing illegally and unlawfully the prized possessions of the narrator's mother, she renewed her friendship with the narrator's mother and promised to keep her belongings in a very safe way, and even promised to hand those things again back to the narrator's mother. But we know her true nature. That was a fake promise on her part. The Second World War broke out and all the Jews were persecuted everywhere. They were killed in large numbers, as we all know. The Germans were in control. The Jews had to leave their homes and possessions behind to save their lives. So ultimately, during the Second World War, when the torture and the violence was at the extreme point, many of the Jews, they had to leave their homes and possessions behind to save their lives. In this background, Mrs. Doling revived her acquaintance with Mrs. S because she was a non-Jewish lady, so there was no threat to her life. But obviously the narrator and her mother, that is Mrs. S, they were rich people but they were Jews. So obviously there was a big threat to their lives. So let me move on. I am continuing once again. In this background, Mrs. Doling revived her acquaintance with Mrs. S and carried away suitcases of precious things, saying she wanted to save all the nice things. But it was a fake promise, it was a hollow promise, because basically in reality her intention was to stuff all those belongings in her own house and never to return those things back to her, because at the back of her mind she knew it very well that Mrs. S won't survive the war. The only reason was that Mrs. S was a Jew, and as you know that during the Second World War a lot of Jews were killed by the German soldiers. So let me move on. Mrs. Doling had no desire, no intention of returning those fine things. Mrs. Doling's behavior cannot be justified. No, we can't support a shrewd-minded lady, a cruel, devilish lady by the name of Mrs. Doling. We can't support her behavior. She acted out of greed and meanness. She did not even admit Mrs. S's daughter into her house and was extremely rude. Now the sad part was that she even haven't admitted Mrs. S's daughter inside the house. Now the behavior that we can notice in case of Mrs. Doling, that behavior can't be appreciated at all. Now I am moving on to question number 5. Very important question. Let me go through the question first, dear students. Why did the narrator say that forgetting Mrs. Doling's address would be the easiest of all the things? Very important question, dear students. Forgetting Mrs. Doling's address would be the easiest of all the things. Why so? Why she was eager to forget Mrs. Doling's address, that is 46 Marconi Street? Why so? What was the reason behind it? Let us come to the answer part now, dear students. The narrator said that forgetting Mrs. Doling's address would be easy because of the excruciating painful experience of the narrator, because it was not a happy experience. The way those things were stuffed inside the house and the way those things were arranged in a very haphazard manner, and because of poor maintenance, lack of proper maintenance, the things were being kept just for the sake of keeping those things, that very much disappointed the narrator. She was saddened beyond words, and she was very upset also to see the crudeness of Mrs. Doling's household and the insensitive manner or the insensitive way the precious antiques of her family were handled or kept. She immediately decided to forget about everything connected with her past. She wanted to continue living her new life. She resolved to forget the address, as she felt that of all the things she had to forget, forgetting the address would be the easiest. Now, of all the things, she realized that of all the things that she had to forget, the first and foremost, the most difficult thing is that forgetting the address. And at that particular moment, though it seems to be difficult, but at that particular juncture, it seemed to be the easiest option for her. Now, I am moving on to question number 6. Very important one, the second last question. The question is, compare the lifestyle of Mrs. S's daughter before the war and after the war. That means you have to compare and contrast the lifestyle of Mrs. S.'s daughter before the war and after the war. Obviously, there were a lot of changes that was noticeable. Now, before the war, Mrs. S and her daughter lived a life of comfort and luxury because they were rich Jews. So they used to lead life full of comfort and luxury. Their house was full of beautiful things, and expensive antiques and crockeries were also found in their house. Their everyday cutlery was made of silver, but things underwent a metamorphic change after the war. After the war, and also during the war, she saw a lot of violence. Their house was destroyed. Precious belongings unlawfully and illegally was taken by Mrs. Doling. And the most tragic thing that happened in the life of the narrator was that she lost her mother forever. The family was probably dead. We get to know about it. Though after the war, Mrs. S.'s daughter came back to the town all alone with a heavy heart. She lived in a small rented flat, we can say, or you can say a small rented room. The bread that she ate was stale and tasteless. She had seen fear and insecurity. Also, because of the atrocities that she had faced, because of that, even after the liberation of the Jews, she had to experience fear phobia, and mental trauma in her mind. She did not even have place to keep those cutlery and other things, because leading a life after the liberation in a one-room flat was itself a very challenging affair for her. Apart from that, her lifestyle did not at all resemble her earlier luxurious living. Earlier, she and her mother, they used to lead a luxurious life. But now, after the war, it seems that, and after the war and after the liberation, it was a very challenging affair. And her life had also underwent a sea change. It was luxury previously, but after the war, it was painstaking and challenging. Now, dear students, I am moving on to the final question, very important. You have to justify the title of the story, the address, how far the title of the story is appropriate. Now, the address is a title that indirectly brings out the pain that war inflicted on the narrator. The address was, as you all know by this time, 46 Marconi Street, where a woman named Mrs. Doling lived with her family. The entire story revolves around this address. So obviously the address itself is a character, we can say, and it's a non-living character, but the address plays a very important role. We can say it plays a very pivotal role, because the entire story related with the narrator, her mother's prized possessions, silver cutleries, and everything illegally and unlawfully taken by Mrs. Doling, who refused to grant permission to the narrator to get inside her house. Mrs. Doling's daughter, kind-hearted, unlike her mother, allowed the narrator inside the house. The narrator saw her mother's prized possessions kept in a haphazard manner that evokes poor maintenance. The narrator going out of the house and promising never to return back to this particular address. So when we consider all these things into the perspective, we can finally come to the conclusion that yes, indeed, 46 Marconi Street, the address, the title is apt or appropriate and highly justified. The address was important to the narrator because her mother had given the family valuables to Mrs. Doling for safekeeping. But Mrs. Doling had betrayed the trust that the narrator's mother had on her. Mrs. Doling had completely betrayed her mother's trust. When after the war was over, that is the reason that this particular story is not only a story related with the Second World War and the after effects of the Second World War, but it is a story of betrayal also, trust and betrayal at the same time, because Mrs. Doling played with the sentiments of the narrator's mother. So, dear students, let me continue. The address was important to the narrator because her mother had given the family valuables to Mrs. Doling for safekeeping, but Mrs. Doling played with the sentiments of the narrator's mother. When after the war was over, the narrator went back to the said address, that is 46 Marconi Street, you will find that the entire story revolves around the address. All the incidents that are mentioned in this story, every incident revolves around that address. She found her family's precious possessions in an ugly setting. Their value was not appreciated and they were used carelessly, and poor maintenance, okay, lack of proper maintenance. There was no proper maintenance. Even Mrs. Doling and Mrs. Doling's daughter, even they don't know which way to use which important thing. So they were being used carelessly. Proper maintenance was also not done. The value of the things were not being appreciated also. So all this disappointed the narrator. She was very, very sad and she felt suffocated deep inside the room and she decided to move out. She was so repelled that she decided to leave the things and forget the address. The address becomes too painful to remember. It becomes symbolic of the shabbiness and the pettiness of Mrs. Doling, because ultimately the address becomes very symbolic with the crude and cold behavior of Mrs. Doling, with the shabbiness and pettiness of Mrs. Doling. She was very keen about getting things back, but ironically resolved to forget about them and begin a new life, leaving the past behind. Now the important thing is that at the very fag end of this story, at the final climax part of this story, we find that ironically it can be stated that the narrator decided to forget the address and the narrator decided to start a new life, leaving the past behind. That is the reason in the course of the discussion related with this particular question, dear students, I told you that all the incidents, even the characters, okay, everything revolves around this particular address. Though it's not a living character, but the address itself is a character, and that is the reason, taking everything into consideration, taking everything in importance, okay, covering up everything, it is very much certain that the title, the address is very much appropriate in the context of this particular story. So dear students, kindly go through this audio presentation, and if there is any problem anywhere, let me know about it. Thank you students. Thank you all.